Hello and welcome to 100 Campaigns That Changed the World. My interview today is with Adrian Lovett, who is currently the CEO of Development Initiatives, but also is well known for playing a key leadership role in campaigns such as Make Poverty History and the Jubilee 2000 campaign. And it's that campaign that we are focusing on today, the campaign to cancel the debts of developing countries. It was an international coalition in over 40 countries, but it was based in the UK. It started in the UK, and the movement coincided with the celebration of the year 2000 in the Catholic Church, but it was also very strong in the Church of England and as Adrian says, in other religious organisations, but also charities, NGOs. Lots of celebrities joined in and global leaders. It was really a formative campaign for me when I was setting out as a person who was interested in these sorts of issues, development, campaigning, advocacy. And in a way, I see it as some ways a high watermark, as I say in the interview. Anyway, here is Adrian and the campaign to cancel the debt of poor countries. Hello and welcome to 100 Campaigns That Changed the World. I'm Steve Tibbett and I'm here with Adrian Lovett, and we're talking about the campaign for the cancellation of debt in developing countries and Jubilee 2000, which was the vehicle for a lot of that campaigning. Welcome, Adrian.
Thanks, Steve. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Yeah, just to start with, I mean, I've already said in the introduction a bit about how Jubilee 2000 came into being. But, I mean, from your memory, what was the story? How did it come about? And, yeah, what were the sort of precursors to it?
It's really hard to find one answer to that question, because I think, perhaps this is the case with things that are perceived to be a success, that there's a, success has many parents, failures that are sadly orphans. And actually, you can trace the threads of Jubilee 2000 and the debt campaign in a number of directions. There has been for decades a tradition of resistance, particularly in Africa and Latin America, to economic conditions imposed from outside, structural adjustment, and so on. That was certainly a really important context at the time in the mid-90s when the Jubilee 2000 campaign was starting to come together. But the specific idea of bringing together the moment, the approaching millennium year, with the notion of writing off the unpayable debts of the world's poorest countries, debts which were being serviced at the cost of human lives and of human progress and future, investment in education and health and so on, all the things that you want resources to go into rather than servicing these historic debts. That idea of linking those two things came from a number of quarters. There were a couple of guys, British older men, Bill Peters, who was a former diplomat, who had started having ideas about this linkage. Another very different person, Martin Dent, who was a politics lecturer from Keele University in the north of England, who never left a meal without food all over his shirt. He was that kind of, the mad professor sort of character. So two very different characters arrived at the same idea, making this linkage over a few years. But there was another really important dimension to it, which was represented by somebody called Isabel Carter, who was a consultant working in international development, but also a very committed Christian. And she only really talked about this more than a decade after the campaign in a very public way. But she talked about how, for her, this was a vision that came to her that came from God. And there was no doubt that whether it was through such a very vivid experience such as she had, and she then became one of the absolutely key founding organizers with Martin and Bill, and they hired a director for the campaign called Anne Pettifor, a brilliant woman who led the campaign. I was her deputy throughout most of the campaign. Whether people came with that sort of specific religious sort of almost instruction as they saw it, a mandate, or whether it was just more in the background and they could see that this campaign resonated with their religious and their ethical and spiritual selves. There were different experiences of that, but there were people coming from all these different sort of backgrounds. So that all sort of wove together into this thread of the religious and the secular, the global south and the global north, the sort of the head and the heart. I think all of that, just by what I would describe as mainly an extraordinary coincidence, came together over a short period.
So you had this sort of religious element, obviously the Jubilee being a reference there. The other part, 2000, you had a deadline in a way.
Yeah.
How did that take shape, and how important do you think it was to have a deadline, some sort of end point?
It was hugely important. I mean, I got involved in late 1997. I'd been working in Parliament for a few years as a researcher to an MP in London. I'd worked previously in local radio as a radio presenter, so I'd sort of not really very relevant qualifications, but I'd heard a little bit about this campaign, this idea of Jubilee 2000. And in the UK, we just had the 1997 election when the new Labour government came to power, and there was a sense of optimism and hope. And I'd heard about this campaign and just thought that sounds like a brilliant idea. Not only the right thing to do, but just a really interesting thing, just a good way of resolving a problem, this what seemed to be this endless problem of these unpayable debts. And yes, the fact that there was this right from the start and to the very end, this notion that the year 2000 was the moment to achieve this, gave a huge amount of energy and sort of, in a way, sustainability to the campaign over that period, because we were always clear it wasn't just going to go on forever. We were clear with decision makers we were trying to persuade that we weren't going to be still around in 2001, 2002 saying how we're getting on. We were very clear that was the deadline, and we got others, including everyone from the Pope to rock stars and so on, to call for the same thing. So it was a bit of a sort of it was a bit circular in a way, because nobody had really said there wasn't a reason why it needed to be done by 2000. But because that moment was there and because we said it should be done, it became an imperative.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned there, some very famous people, and there were a lot of well-known, prominent people from politics, but also from show business and other areas that were involved. I mean, I hesitate to say, how did you get them involved? Because maybe that's a long story, but maybe the better question is, how important do you think they were, and what were the upsides and the downsides of working with those sorts of people?
I mean, for me, it was an absolutely essential part of the success of the campaign. It wouldn't have achieved what it achieved without that side. That alone, of course, would not have been enough, let's be clear. without the policy rigor, without the extraordinary grassroots mobilization that people saw as a visible expression of the campaign, it would have been nothing. But we were very clear from very early on that we wanted this to resonate with people who didn't normally think about these things, with people who weren't looking at the state of parts of the world and thinking about it a lot. And that was in order to get the attention of the policymakers. It wasn't an end in itself. It was simply because we knew, or we believed, that if we could create that kind of noise, that public energy, then politicians would be much more likely to take notice. So, yeah, it was from very early on a determined effort. There was a specific piece around Bono, who got involved in the campaign around 1998, I think, and we talked to him right from the start about not just how he could help us make this famous, but about how he could help persuade policymakers. And he was very attuned to that from the start. And as everybody's seen and everything he's done since then, that was his instinct too, was not just, okay, what can I do in a rock show on a stage, but who do I need to talk to help you to persuade the people that need to be persuaded? And that was from the very beginning the heart of the conversations with people like him. But there was an extraordinary moment where we wanted to sort of get the music industry more broadly on board, and over a series of meetings and conversations, we landed on the idea of doing something at the Brit Awards one year, which was the UK music industry's big annual moment on primetime television. And we realized that in order to have something to offer to the Brit Awards, for them to give us a sort of a space, a moment, we had to bring something. So Jamie Drummond, who was a key part of the campaign and a great ally and campaigner over the years, had not only started to make inroads with Bono, but was also in touch with people who were working with Muhammad Ali. And we thought, right, we can bring these two together. That ought to be an offer that the TV people will think, yeah, that's worth putting on telly for 5 or 6 minutes. And I was there that night, sitting with Muhammad Ali at one table, Bono up on the stage, Bono receiving on behalf of Jubilee 2000 a sort of special award from the music industry, which was, invented for that purpose, just to sort of make sense of it in an awards show. He marched through the crowd to the table where we were, presented it to Muhammad Ali, who received it on behalf of the campaign. And the next day, we took Muhammad Ali through Brixton and did this, this extraordinary energy around him and what he represented, and actually the moment that it really made sense to me was then that evening, because the TV show went out 24 hours after the recording. So the previous night we'd been there in the room. That following night, I was at home sitting on the sofa thinking, they're not going to keep it in. They're not going to keep it in. They'll cut it out. They'll say it's too political. They'll say it's, whatever. And it was in, and it was every moment was there. And that was probably the moment, I think, when I thought, okay, we've got something here.
So you got partly through this high level, if you like, celebrity or prominent people access. You got access then to decision makers, not just because of that, but also the role of the church and the campaigning force. When you got that access, what were the conversations like there? And I'd like to know a little bit about, did they pour cold water on this idea, or did you get immediate traction? Were people excited? How difficult was that? Were those initial conversations with decision makers?
A lot of it was difficult. I mean, it's because the first thing to say on that is that this wasn't. Sometimes I think hindsight, people look back and say, yeah, this was sort of part of the aid campaign. It really wasn't. It was sort of the opposite. It was about justice, and it was about correcting a historic injustice. And so it was, conceptually and sort of, the framing of it was challenging to many in power, whether in finance ministries in the UK and other major countries, or in the World Bank and the IMF, particularly the IMF, who for whom this was just anathema. The idea that that there was ever a circumstance where the lenders didn't get paid. Which of course there is, because it's called bankruptcy. It happens in the commercial world all the time, and it's a necessary correction. So we had to win that sort of intellectual argument. There was a lot of resistance to that, but then there was just the sort of the political obstacles, because as with any campaign, every campaigner knows, you're not just having to win the argument. You're having to capture attention sufficiently for enough time, for enough people to get something done. And that sometimes that time is not weeks or months, sometimes it's years, and you've got to sustain that attention, haven't you? So that was that's why we wanted the churches. That's why we needed the trade unions out on the street. That's why we needed the music industry and so on, because it could help us keep that attention. But I remember, even with the UK government was, relatively speaking, in a better place than many on this. This was the era when Gordon Brown had come in as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and undoubtedly had a personal interest and commitment to this. But I can remember, a conversation with a very senior official of his just after Bill Clinton in the US had rather grandly announced that the US was going to cancel 100% of the debt. Not 92% or 94%, whatever. They're just going to wipe out 100% of the debt. You remember the moment? Yeah. I was in the room in Washington when he made that announcement at a World Bank meeting, and I went back home to London, and I got on the phone to the Treasury in the UK and to one senior person, and I said, look, you've got to do it. You've got to do it. And they said to me, can't, Adrian, we can't. I've told you we can't. And I said, yeah, but you can. And I did. I think I had a sort of actual, a basis for how they could, sort of some numbers and some policy stuff. But really, I was just saying, just do it. Just find a way. And the answer again, it was the most difficult conversation I had in the whole time with anyone from the UK government, because the answer back was, no, you don't understand, Adrian. We've given you everything we can. We can't do any more. And about 5 weeks later, they did it. Right? They followed suit. They did it in their own way. They announced it in their own way. It wasn't sort of, seen as a sort of concession to us, but they did it.
Do you ever remember any feedback about why they did make that change, or why they changed their mind? I suppose I'm interested in whether was it that they felt pressure, or was it that they felt this is an opportunity to be a good government, a good global player?
I think it was both. I think they, in the case of the UK government, they saw this as an area of international leadership for them, and the idea that another government, the US in this case, was going to kind of take their place in that leadership role was politically awkward for them. So I think they didn't want to lose that position. So they could see the sort of political calculation was, can we get back in the leadership again? But I think it was also, often the people that we would speak to were the political advisors, as much as, or perhaps more than, the sort of deep policy people. And the political advisors, as you know, and as many campaigners know, they're dealing with a machine that they're working with of bureaucrats and of technical people and of great specialists. There's 1,000 people saying no in that situation, isn't there? And sometimes the political people are saying no too because they don't want to embarrass their boss or whatever, But sometimes they're the people that remind the political person they work for, actually, this is why you got into this, isn't it? This is why you get up in the morning. This is why you got elected and you wanted to do some good. And this, I think, when there was the prompt from another government saying, okay, we're going to take a step forward, which looked like a leapfrog over the UK, I think the UK was then able to say, come on, we've got to push through these no's and move it to a yes, because really in the end, is it going to cost us a lot? No. And does it put us back in that leadership position? Yes. And the result for us, from the campaign point of view, was great because for whatever reason, self-interested or otherwise, we had momentum. You had the dominoes starting to fall, and from there, and we moved on, and eventually the whole of the G7 aligned behind that position, and in due course, although years later, the World Bank and the IMF as well.
We are going to take a short break there, but we'll be back in a moment with Adrian Lovett. Hi, welcome back. We're here with Adrian Lovett. We're talking about cancellation of debt for poor countries and the Jubilee 2000 campaign for that. Adrian, we were talking a bit about the successes of the campaign before the break. But there must have been some bumps in the road, and particularly, were there bumps either within the campaign, different parts of the campaign disagreeing with strategy or whatever, or opposition that you found particularly problematic or difficult? I mean, I don't know, for instance, what other parties were saying, or other commentators, or other economists that were sort of pouring cold water on the idea.
There was this orthodoxy, obviously, around debt and lending, and we were challenging that orthodoxy in a very, I think, radical way. So there was unsurprisingly resistance to that from those who consider themselves to be sort of sound money people, both whether in government or in the private sector or whatever, or in the media as well. Certain news outlets and so on would naturally take that stance. We kind of headed off quite a lot of that because we had people on the conservative side, not just in the UK, in the US very much so, who were saying, no, this is sound, this makes sense, this is the right thing to do, as well as economically sound. So I think that the difficulties, what we came up against was mainly just the politics of the challenge of sustaining momentum over that period of time. It was helpful that we had a limited period of time, that we'd said that this has got to be done by the end of 2000. So we had 3 or 4 years from the sort of the early peak of the campaign. But even within that, we hooked ourselves onto the annual cycle of G7 and G8 meetings, finance ministers and leaders meetings, because at the time that was where the action was, we felt, and where the power was, and certainly where the money was when it came to the debt issue. And so, we had a couple of extraordinarily big moments around a summit, the G8 summit in the UK in Birmingham in 1998, where we had 70,000 people surround the G8 venue in Birmingham with a human chain. And that was the first big sort of expression of support for the campaign. But inevitably, the difficulty then is, how do you keep that up? How do you maintain that? And, the following year, we did something in Cologne at the German G8 summit. And that was good, but it was sort of 20 to 30,000 people. The following year, as I recall, we knew that the G8 was going to be in Okinawa in Japan, very remote for most people, very, very hard to get the presence of people there. So, having sort of, I suppose, set on the strategy of using these annual moments, we were then a little bit vulnerable to the circumstances of those moments, the leadership from the host G8 country and so on. So we had to try to compensate for that. So that was certainly a challenge. But there was lots that didn't work, Steve. I mean, and I think, we all look back at campaigns, don't we? And, failed campaigns have successes and successful campaigns have failures. And it's really important that, campaigners give themselves permission to fail. And we certainly did in that campaign plenty of times. I remember a ridiculous stunt that I came up with to burn a laptop on a beach in Okinawa, actually, to capture the world's attention. And we decided, this was the thing, because that G8 summit, they decided the theme was going to be IT and laptops and stuff. So we said, but they hadn't finished the job on debt. So they borrowed. We took a laptop off one of our interns and gave him a new one. And burnt it on the beach. We set fire to it, and it was an extraordinary spectacle. And we had this sort of line written on the screen saying, "This is worth nothing until you cancel the debt." And we had the world's media, the G8 media, there, sort of photographers rushed out down this beach, and security was sort of being kept at bay just long enough for us to get this picture. And I thought, that's going to go around the world. Nobody saw it. If you and I were watching it now, that'd probably double the audience of people that ever seen that. So, you have to try those things, and they don't all work, not by any means.
I mean, can you pinpoint any particular tactics that you thought, well, this was actually really impactful? What were they? Did you have a sense of those in advance that, this is going to be huge?
I think that and again, I definitely take no credit for this. This was all in place before I was involved, but the imagery of chains was an extraordinary asset to the campaign. And obviously, it started from this idea of people in debt being enslaved. It took a resonance. It resonated from the anti-slavery campaign explicitly and deliberately. And that chain idea then just, when you gave that to a lot of brilliant activists and enthusiastic, often sort of church-going folk, you said, right, do something with chains. It just set people's imagination on fire, and of course that then became the human chain, and that was a feature of the campaign, not only at the big G8 moments, but it was something that people could do in their local park on a Saturday as they were sort of raising names for the global petition that we had. It was something that, people could use that chain imagery in all sorts of ways. I think I did joke in a speech at the end of the campaign when we were wrapping it up that I'd seen far too many vicars in chains for a young man of my age. But there was also, as well as the chains, I just mentioned there, the petition. So we agreed at the start that we would have a petition. It was started by Martin, the co-founder at Keele University, where he was a politics lecturer. He got a few thousand signatures in the early 90s there. So we built on that. And we said from early on, well, let's just make it the biggest petition in the world. And someone went and looked up what that was, and it was something in Korea that had 21 million signatures or something. We thought, okay, that's what we've got to get past. And at this stage, I think we had 1 million or something. So we had about 3 years to get to that number. And we got to, in the end, I think 24 million, which is still, I think, the largest number of handwritten hand-signed petition signatories that's been ever done. We got to that just in time, just at the end as the campaigns come to an end. But again, the chains thing and the petition thing just gave activists and the political figures who were watching us and were getting stuff from us, it gave them a sense of the build of the campaign and the continuity of the message and the imagery around it.
Yeah, and we've touched on the church a couple of times, but it struck me at the time, because I was around the space at this sort of time, just how good they were at organising and how many people they could mobilise. And we saw that again in the Make Poverty History campaign and the trade justice campaign. And I think there are still I know there are still Make Poverty History groups in churches around the country. It's probably still Jubilee 2000 groups in different churches around the country. How much, could you say a bit about how important the church was, but also, how you linked up with them, how you not controlled them, but how you mobilized them in a way that was helpful and not a hindrance?
Yeah, we certainly didn't control them. And that did mean that some of the expressions of the campaign from time to time were visibly not controlled, and, not everything quite had the right tone or whatever, But that was the price that we paid for scale and for just empowering people with a little toolkit and letting them go with it. But yeah, the church part of it, which was, and we should be specific, I guess, it was predominantly Christian, but actually in the Jewish faith, this concept resonated very much so. This was an Old Testament, not a New Testament concept of the cancellation of debts. And over time, there was terrific engagement and leadership in the campaign from Muslim networks as well. But it certainly started with the Christian groups. And I think there, as you say, it was part inspiration, part organization. And the inspiration was really important. All of that certainly drove the moral kind of power of the campaign, and it drove people to want to, make a journey to Cologne from some other part of Europe or whatever. But it was the organization that those church networks brought that was just incredibly important, including, the big Christian agencies like Christian Aid and Tear Fund and World Vision and so on, and CAFOD, the Catholic agency. But also just at the sort of the parish level, the community level, as you said, this was in sermons, regularly on a Sunday in churches. It was stuff that people talked about in the coffee room after the service about, what are you doing this week for Jubilee 2000? It was incredible, and I that's not a tradition. It doesn't speak to me. Brought up a Catholic, but that was something that I left behind in my teens. And yet I could, I remember speaking on a platform in St. Albans Abbey, this extraordinarily grand religious setting, which had sort of 2,000 people in who were there for Jubilee 2000. And you could feel this sort of wave of moral energy and moral power, which was incredibly humbling to be part of.
It does come across as a campaign where there was less dissonance, more sort of unity. And was it in a way the high watermark? We've talked about the numbers involved and the numbers of signatories and the high level people. I suppose the modern equivalent in some ways is climate. That's where there's a lot of campaigning now, but it's much more diverse or depending on your take, controversial, different tactics. There isn't one unified campaign in the way there was with debt. Maybe it's not possible. To what extent do you see Jubilee 2000 as sort of a high watermark of that kind of model of campaigning? And, are we in a worse position now or a better? How do you see it?
Yeah, I guess it was. You had a great conversation with Chris Stalker talking about the sort of the eras of campaigns, if you like, and a sort of an early era of the suffragettes and anti-slavery and I guess up to anti-apartheid, where the protagonists were largely or often those most affected, those with lived experience, and a more recent era when perhaps we're going back more to that, and the bit in between. I guess that's where Jubilee 2000 sat. Having said that, although I think it's fair to say that it was a sort of a largely representative campaign, I also think that, when I remember the way people who were part of the campaign, not paid to be part of it, not professionals, but the volunteers, the activists, when they talked about the campaign, whether they were British, whether they were Germans, Americans, whatever, they didn't describe it as a sort of I'm doing this for poor people somewhere else. They invariably talked about it as I talked about it, which was to say, I'm not having this. My government shouldn't be doing this. This is about me and my relationship with the government that's supposed to represent me, whether I'm British or American or German or French or whatever. And it was a sense of not of sort of course, the intended impact of the campaign was that there should be a positive benefit for humanity in a very real way. But I think the impulse was more direct, and it was more about all of us having agency and having the ability to engage and influence the people that are supposed to represent us.
I'm interested in how you define success. And, you obviously did define success as, I guess, 100% of the cancellation of bilateral debt, something akin to that. But we also know that then you went on to be director of Drop the Debt. You had another job to do there. Then Jubilee, then Make Poverty History took up the debt issue. And then Jubilee Debt Campaign continues to this day, and still talking about debt a lot. Debt is an issue, and perhaps will always be an issue of focus and problems, especially for poor countries. I mean, to what extent do we had those successes over time, but it keeps coming back, doesn't it? So how do you view that? And what lessons does that tell us about how you campaign for an issue like this, which is quite complex?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, and the Jubilee debt folks now and others are dealing with a new debt crisis, and that wasn't supposed to happen. If I'm honest, that was when we were doing Jubilee 2000. A big part of the pitch, and it was in the core materials that we produced, was that this was a one-off write-off, and that helped us win the argument for people who said, "Oh, if you just start cancelling debts, it'll no one will ever lend again." Turns out that's not the case, and actually because of that, there is unfortunately the need, arguably, to write off debt again. Now, it's sort of a generation later, so you might say, well, it's not like we established a pattern that meant every 3 or 4 years you had to write off debt. This was 25 years ago, but it does, if I'm honest, it does give it has given me over the years sort of pause for thought that what we strived for and what we very explicitly asked for was linked to the Millennium Moment, that this wouldn't happen again for another 1,000 years. That was the notion that we believed, and the fact that has not been possible, that actually debt is a problem again. You could say, well, that was a failure of our campaign in not doing a good enough job on the second part, right? The first part was get the debts cancelled. The second part was establish a fair and transparent process for lending in the future. And someone like Anne Pettifor, who led the campaign, was very passionate about that and still is, and rightly so. And maybe we didn't do a good enough job on that part. And that's why we've still got once again, we've got a problem, it seems, of unsustainable and irresponsible lending that needs to be addressed. But yeah, I mean, I guess you point to the long tail, as I sometimes call it, of campaigning. We had those moments in the late 90s, which felt like, we had words in the communiques, we had speeches in parliaments, we had those moments where you think, well, they've agreed. But that, of course, as we know, is not enough. I remember actually a girl, maybe 12-year-old girl, who on the 16th of May, 1998, which was the day we formed that human chain around the centre of Birmingham, we just sort of finished it. We were sort of wrapping up. I was putting away a microphone lead or something, and this girl came over to me, and and her mum was sort of behind her, looking at me as if to say, "I hope you got a good answer for my daughter." And she came up to me and she said, "What did they say?" And I said, "Who? What do you mean?" And she said, "The leaders, what did they say?" And she was looking at me very sternly and intently. And I suddenly realized I had the hopes, the dreams of a 12-year-old girl in my hands. And I thought, I don't know what to say, because at that stage, we'd really just got going. But we had, we'd got it on the agenda. And I said to her, well, take a look at the newspapers tomorrow morning. This was the 90s. We'll find out then, because we don't know yet. They're looking at it now. The G8 are inside the building and so on. And she said, okay. And I wanted to, punch myself the following morning when I remember the Observer newspaper, the front page headline was G8 leaders snub debt protest. And I immediately thought of that girl. And I thought, what have I done? Now, I like to think that she was as smart as she looked, and she was a patient woman, became a patient woman, and that she was there 7 years later, perhaps, as an older teenager for Make Poverty History, that she's there now, presumably in her 30s, and advocating for climate action on climate change and things that we care about. And, but it was a reminder, firstly, that, when you do these campaigns, especially when you try to link the head and the heart, you carry a responsibility that you sort of should carry carefully, and also that there is a long tail to these things, and it's usually longer than you think, and you just gotta keep.
Well, that sounds like a good place to wrap up. So thanks so much, Adrian, for your thoughts, and I think those are really valuable lessons. So I appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve.